The Māori people are the indigenous and native inhabitants of the island of Aotearoa, commonly known to the rest of the world as New Zealand. They first arrived to New Zealand somewhere around 1300 CE from eastern Polynesia. Aotearoa, meaning the land of the thin white cloud, was the home of the Māori alone until 1642, when the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman discovered the island. Tasman was the first European to ever come across New Zealand and the first to ever encounter and interact with the Māori people. Later, in 1755, another European came to New Zealand and had a much more permanent impact, Captain James Cook. Cook was the first European to provide a detailed outline of the island and compiled the first collection of vocabulary of the Māori language. It is this language, spoken by the people who came to New Zealand in the 1300s and first documented by James Cook in 1755, that I'm discussing here today. In 1840, under the Treaty of Waitangi, the British Empire annexed the territory of New Zealand. The new colonial government saw the tribal and communal ways of the Māori as barbaric and uncivilized. Eager to assimilate the Māori into good lower-class workers for the empire, they began a long-term project to ultimately destroy the Māori culture and language, and they very nearly succeeded. The first of these many attempts at cultural destruction and assimilation were the early mission schools that were established in 1814 to civilize the native population. Their mission of converting Māori from barbarism to civilization was predicated on notions of racial and cultural superiority. These mission schools were established with the intention of teaching Christianity to the Māori people. Many Māori voluntarily sent their children to these mission schools, as they thought that it would let them have all the benefits of Western civilization that they saw the colonizers have. As these independent schools got absorbed into the newly created territory of New Zealand, the colonial government became unhappy with them. First of all, they wanted the curriculum changed from one focused on religion and scripture to one focused on a traditional Western education that would make it easier for the colony to use the Māori people as subservient laborers. The other main complaint, and the one that I will be putting more focus on here, was that they were conducting their teaching mostly in Māori. Since the goal of the missionaries was to convert the Māori people to Christianity and civilization, it only makes sense that they would teach in Māori and even translate the Bible into Māori. For the colonial government keen on assimilation and the destruction of the native culture, however, the language presented a barrier to be defeated. Schools were instructed to teach exclusively in English, and students who spoke Māori in school would be beaten and punished. Over the course of generations of stigma, discrimination, and the repression of culture, the Māori language has become in serious danger of going extinct. But before we talk more about that, let's learn a little about the language itself. As with almost all languages, Māori is comprised of sounds. It has, like many neighbouring Polynesian languages, a relatively small phonological inventory, with 10 consonants and 10 vowels, 5 short, 5 long. Here is a brief overview of all the sounds in Māori and what they, well, sound like. First, with consonants, there are the plosives, pa, ta, and ka. These are written as p, t, and k, respectively. Interestingly, Māori has no voiced consonants whatsoever, although it is thought that its predecessor Proto-Eastern Polynesian had both voiced and voiceless consonants, which were simply combined in Māori. Next are the nasals, ma, na, and ngā, all of which appear in English, although are used slightly differently. While ngā is an English sound, think the ng in sing, it cannot be used to begin a syllable, while in Māori it can in fact only be used to start a syllable. These are transcribed as m, n, and ng respectively. Māori has two fricatives, fa and ha. While these are not uncommon sounds, what is uncommon in Māori is the lack of any sibilants. Sibilants like sa, za, sha, and ja are the most common fricative consonants and occur in many languages across the world. So it is interesting that they are not present in Māori, while other, less common consonants are. While ha is written as you might expect with an H, fa is written with a WH, which might be misinterpreted as a native English speaker as hua, a sound which does not appear in Māori. The closely related wa does exist in Māori, however, and is transcribed the same as in English with a W. Lastly is the voiced alveolar tap ra, which is transcribed as R and quite difficult for me to pronounce. For a better pronunciation, here is the version that can be found on the IPA's official website.
Ra, ara.
While I have certainly tried to pronounce all the Māori in this project correctly, I do understand that it is likely in many instances of this sound especially, I have pronounced it closer to the English ra. Next, the vowels. Māori has very few vowels, only 5, with a long version of each. These vowels are a, e, o, and u, and are written a, e, I, o, and u, respectively. As I previously said, Māori distinguishes between short and long vowels, meaning it also has a, e, o, and u. This can be heard most clearly in the name of the language itself. Hear the difference between Māori and Māori. The way that these vowels are written has been a subject of some debate for linguists across the world. For quite a while, the long vowels in Māori were written as double vowels. For instance, Māori with a macron would be written as Māori with 2 A's. Some parts of New Zealand still use this as the official spelling. The reason for this stems from a linguistic debate on whether the long vowels of Māori are clusters of identical single vowels, in which case they would be written as the double letter, or separate phonemes altogether. The latter idea is the more widely accepted, but it is by no means universal. Māori's syllables are simple. They follow CV format, meaning they only end in vowels, and there are no consonant clusters. Morphology is how the smallest language units, or morphemes, work together to make words. All languages have morphology to some degree, although some have more than others. Some languages, like Latin, are fusional, where morphemes can carry multiple meanings, like how the O at the end of habeo tells the listener that the verb is not only singular, but also present and in the first person. Other languages, like Turkish, are agglutinating, where they have separate morphemes for each piece of information which gets added to the end of the root. On the other end of the spectrum are isolating languages such as Mandarin. These languages have separate words that encode this information rather than adding them to other morphemes. There are no tense morphemes in Mandarin, so xiaoyu could be it is raining, it has rained, it will rain, or any other tense. There are simply separate words that are used if the information can't be gathered through context. Māori is one of these isolating languages, and as such has almost no inflectional morphology to speak of. That is not to say it has none, but comparatively to a language like Latin, Turkish, or certainly an even more synthetic language like Navajo, Māori has a very simple morphology. The basic unit of syntax in Māori is called the phrase. A phrase is determined by a combination of an initiator and a base. A noun phrase, for example, might consist of te, the definite singular non-personal, followed by a base like tangata, man. Only when they are put together do they become the proper noun phrase. In this sense, te tangata, the man. In a sense, these initiators could be seen as a sort of fusional morphology. When combined with another word, they attach multiple pieces of information to it and can even change their meaning. There are many different types of phrases, each of which is made by a combination of an initiator and a base. Noun phrases, verb phrases, possessive phrases, locative phrases, negative phrases, and many more. There are different types of bases that are used in different phrases. Noun bases for noun phrases, locative bases for locative phrases, and so on. But for verbs, there are 2 different bases. Stative bases, such as ora, alive, which cannot take the passive, and universal bases, such as kia, to say, which can. Say works with the passive. I can say, I said, or it was said. That makes sense. Alive doesn't, though. I am alive. It was alived? It just doesn't make sense. For an example of a verb phrase, look at the phrase I haere, went. It is a combination of the initiator I, in the past, and the stative base haere, go. These phrases then come together to form full sentences, like Ka tapahia e te tangata te rako. The man cut down the tree. As can be seen in the sentence above, word order in Māori is verb, subject, object. This is highly unusual, as very, very few languages do not start with the subject. Another unusual aspect of Māori syntax is that, despite being an accusative nominative language and not an ergative absolutive one, relative pronouns cannot be used for the direct object. For example, in English you could say, the dog that you like is brown. In that sentence, the dog is made into the direct object by the relative pronoun that. This isn't possible in Māori, however, and so has convinced many linguists that Māori was originally an ergative language that later became an accusative one. As we have just explored, Māori has a complex and intricate system of particles, which include prepositions, articles, verbal particles, and pronouns. These particles play the role of initiators in phrases and give morphological information about the base. The pronoun system of Māori in particular is rather complex and shows a variety of cases and distinctions that are highly separated from English. In Māori, pronouns are distinguished by number into singular, dual, and plural. They are also distinguished into first, second, and third person, and within the first person dual and plural, also into inclusive, if the we you're talking about includes the person you're talking to, and exclusive, if the we includes someone who isn't present. While the full syntax of Māori is of course even more complex and intricate than I have explained here, this is a brief overview that should give some ideas of the basic structure of the language. Now, with a greater understanding of the Māori language, one major question remains. What's next? Over the course of hundreds of years of oppression by colonial powers, the number of Māori speakers has enormously reduced, and in fact is still declining. This raises the obvious question of whether or not Māori is going to go extinct, and if it does, how soon? While it is impossible to definitively answer whether or not Māori is going extinct, there are a few interesting things that are worth talking about that relate to it. First of all is the impact that English has had on Māori. When two languages are spoken in the same region for hundreds of years, interactions and impacts between the languages are unavoidable. Māori is no exception to this, and due to it being a minority language in a country where the majority language, New Zealand English, is spoken nearly everywhere, some aspects of Māori have seriously changed. In a study done by the Māori and New Zealand English project, it was discovered that New Zealand English is currently undergoing a major sound change in relation to its vowels. Many vowels are becoming more centralized, with the exception of I, which is becoming even higher. While the reasons for this change are unknown, what isn't unknown is how it is impacting the Māori language. In this same study, Māori was seen to also be undergoing a sound change. And what's most interesting is that the changes happening in Māori are the same ones happening in New Zealand English. This shows that the effect New Zealand English is having on Māori isn't just grammatical or lexical loans, but entire shifts in vowel pronunciation and the future evolution of the language to parallel New Zealand English. While this change and the link between Māori and New Zealand English isn't inherently a bad thing, nor does it show the death of the Māori language, what is a bad sign for the future is what was shown in another, more recent study by the Māori New Zealand English project. This next study focused on the initiator ka and its variant ka. The grammatical rule behind the difference between these two is complex and arbitrary and honestly doesn't really matter to the results of the study, but I will give a brief summary. Ka, which is the initiator which shows the inceptive, has two separate allomorphs, one with a short a and one with a long a. The long form is used when the following base has only 2 vowels, the minimum that a base in Māori can have. In any other situation, the short form is used. What the study discovered is that older Māori who lived in the 19th century used the ka rule both correctly and consistently. They knew when to use which form and did so almost perfectly every time. When the study tested older Māori living today, the results were different. Despite these still being people who generally learned Māori as their native language, they used the ka rule inconsistently. The use was only correct about half the time, and the speakers were significantly more unsure about when to use either one. Lastly, the study tested among young Māori today and found that speakers simply didn't use the rule at all. The use of the short form exclusively in the young group was consistent, and they used this new rule correctly almost all the time. Over the course of just a few generations, the more complex ka rule was simply lost. Grammatical simplifications like this are a common sign of a language reaching the end of its life. Māori today has very few native speakers, and those who speak it natively likely only speak it at home and not anywhere else. People who learn Māori as a second language generally do so with poor instruction and from people who don't know the language fluently. Adding to this, despite the huge effort in recent years to revitalize the language, Māori is still losing speakers. All of these signs are bad and point to an idea that Māori may be gone for good in the not-so-distant future. It isn't a guarantee, and if enthusiasm for the protection and revitalization of the language continues or increases from the rate it is at now, it very well might survive. But by both loss of older, more complex rules and from interactions from English, it will be forever changed.